5. 5 billion years ago, the Earth was nothing more than a molten sphere spinning in a violent young solar system. Volcanoes roared endlessly. Meteorites pummeled the surface, and oceans of lava defined the landscape. But in the chaos, something profound began to stir deep within the boiling seas and hydrothermal vents. Rich in minerals and energy, the foundation of life quietly took shape. At first, there were only simple molecule amino acids, lipids and nucleotides coming together by chance and necessity over countless millennia. These ingredients formed more complex structures. The first self-replicating molecules emerged, setting in motion a process that would define the future of the planet. The origin of life had begun not with grandeur, but in microscopic whispers. The first true life forms were single-celled prokaryotes, organisms without a nucleus. Archaea and bacteria thrived in extreme environments, feeding on chemicals rather than sunlight. They adapted to scalding heat, crushing pressure, and toxic gases. Their existence seemed almost alien, yet they were the ancestors of all life to come. These early microbes were not only survivors, they were creators through their metabolic processes. Some began releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. This change was slow, but it marked the beginning of a transformation that would take billions of years to complete. As oxygen accumulated, the Earth's skies turned blue, and the oceans began to teem with new kinds of life. Over time, some single-celled organisms evolved into eukaryotes, with internal structures like nuclei and mitochondria. These more advanced cells likely arose through symbiotic relationships between simpler cells, a cooperation that led to a revolution in biological complexity. Eukaryotes opened the door to multicellular life cells began to specialize, forming simple colonies that gradually turned into organisms with tissues, organs, and primitive systems. This new level of organization allowed life to explore new environments, occupy new niches, and diversify beyond anything seen before. As time moved forward, multicellular life flourished in the oceans. Strange forms floated through the water, feeding, reproducing, and evolving. Though they lacked bones or shells, they represented a critical step forward. They were the ancestors of every plant animal and insect that would one day inhabit the land. During this time, the planet underwent massive changes. Tectonic activity reshaped continents and seafloors. The climate shifted dramatically. Yet through every upheaval, life persisted. The rhythm of evolution marched on, slow but relentless. The oceans remained the cradle of life for eons. Here in the darkness, some creatures developed eyes to detect light, appendages to move with purpose, and mouths to feed more efficiently. Competition drove innovation. Predators emerged along with prey that developed armor, speed, and camouflage. Life was still microscopic in many cases, but the stage was being set for something greater. The oxygen levels continued to rise, the climate continued to stabilize, and the foundation for a future complexity became stronger. Soon the world would witness its first biological explosion, burst of diversity that would change everything. But before that burst, there was patience, billions of years of unseen struggle and gradual change, tiny victories at the molecular level, small steps leading to giant leaps. This was the beginning. The Earth before insects, before reptiles, before dinosaurs. It was a world dominated by simplicity and potential, and though its creatures were invisible to the naked eye, they were the architects of every complex being that would follow. In the silent currents of the ancient oceans, life whispered its first words. The earth listened, and from those whispers a symphony began to form. It would take billions of years to hear its crescendo, but the first notes had already been played 635 million years ago. The world stood on the edge of something new for over 3 billion years. Life had existed only in the form of microscopic organisms, thriving in the oceans and shaping the environment molecule by molecule. But now the Earth was about to witness its first breath of biological complexity, visible to the naked eye. This was the beginning of the Ediacaran period, a time that would reveal the earliest known forms of multicellular life. The silence of simplicity was about to be broken in the Ediacaran oceans. Life remained largely soft-bodied. These creatures left no bones behind, no shells or claws, only impressions in the seafloor mud that would later become fossilized. But those impressions told a story unlike anything seen before. They showed forms that hinted at body symmetry, at repeated structures, and even at mobility. These were not single cells drifting passively in the water. They were multicellular organisms with shape, size, and behavior. The environment of the Ediacaran was changing, shaped by tectonic activity, climate shifts, and increasing oxygen levels. Oxygen, the invisible fuel of complexity, had been building up in the oceans and atmosphere thanks to the work of ancient cyanobacteria. Now it had reached a threshold. With more oxygen available, cells could produce more energy. With more energy, organisms could grow larger, develop new structures, and attempt new strategies for survival. The creatures of this era came in strange, unfamiliar forms. Some looked like fronds anchored to the seafloor, others like segmented discs or quilted pillows. They had no eyes, no mouths, no obvious organs. Their method of feeding remains a mystery. To this day, some scientists believe they absorb nutrients directly through their skin, while others may have hosted symbiotic microbes that help them digest organic matter. Among these strange beings were organisms like Dickinsonia, a flat, oval-shaped creature with rib-like segments. It measured several seemed over a meter in length, lying motionless on the ocean floor. Yet despite its simplicity, Dickinsonia represents one of the earliest known examples of a complex, multicellular animal. There was also Charia, resembling a feather or a fern rising from the sea floor like a ghostly plant. But it was no plant. It lived in deep waters where sunlight could not penetrate it, likely fed by filtering microscopic particles from the water, capturing nutrients carried in the slow-moving currents. These life forms represented a major evolutionary experiment. For the first time, organisms began to exhibit bilateral symmetria, left and right side. Others showed signs of radial symmetry, like the spokes of a wheel. This was a critical step toward the development of organized bodies, with heads, tails, and specialized parts. Movement also began to change. Some creatures seemed to be anchored in place, but others left faint trails behind them. These trails, fossilized in rock, suggest that certain Ediacaran animals could glide or crawl slowly across the seafloor. Locomotion, had entered the evolutionary stage, though primitive by modern standards. These first steps in mobility and structure laid the groundwork for everything to come. The Ediacaran biota were experimenting with forms and functions that would eventually lead to muscles, nervous systems, and brains. Not all the creatures from this time can be easily classified. Many have no clear, modern descendants. They belong to no known kingdom or film. They are the mysterious forerunners of life, evolutionary experiments that may have led to dead Enza, perhaps to lineages that survive in ways we have yet to understand. What is clear is that the Ediacaran period marked the beginning of a new biological rhythm. Ecosystems began to form. Organisms started to interact in more complex ways. Competition, cooperation, and predation were slowly introduced into the dance of life. The presence of microbial mats, dense colonies of bacteria and algae covering the seafloor, created a unique ecosystem. Some Ediacaran organisms lived on top of these mats while others burrowed beneath them. These interactions created the first semblance of ecological layers, niches that allowed different life forms to coexist and specialize, but life during this period was still fragile. The bodies of these organisms were soft and vulnerable. Any disruption, be it a change in temperature, ocean chemistry, or sea levels, could mean extinction. And for many Ediacaran creatures, extinction did come. Only a fraction of their diversity would survive into the next era. Still, their existence was revolutionary. They were the first to take shape in a visible way, the first to experiment with form and function beyond the microscopic. They turned the seafloor into a living canvas filled with patterns and textures that told a story of life reaching beyond its limits as the Ediacaran period progressed. The rate of evolutionary innovation increased. Organisms began to explore new ways of organizing their bodies, responding to their environments, and interacting with each other. This slow crescendo of complexity was leading toward something inevitable and astonishing: the Cambrian explosion. The fossil record becomes richer as we move forward in time, but the Ediacaran remains a puzzle with many missing pieces. Its organisms vanish from the rock layers just as suddenly as they appear. Did they die out, unable to compete with more advanced life? Or did they evolve, changing shape so completely that we no longer recognize them in their descendants? Some researchers believe that certain Ediacaran lineages gave rise to sponges, cnidarians, and other basal animals. Others think they represent an entirely separate branch of life, a failed experiment in multicellularity. Whichever the case, their legacy is profound. They prove that complexity was possible, that life could organize itself into forms larger, more interactive, and more adaptable than anything. Before their disappearance marks one of evolution's great transitions. They cleared the stage for new actor creatures with skeletons, eyes, and claws, but they were the first ensemble, the original performers in the theater of animal life. Stellar in the cold, dark oceans of the Ediacaran, life took its first steps into visibility. It sculpted forms from softness, built patterns from cells, and filled the ocean floor with silent alien motion. These were the earliest chapters of form and function, written in the quiet depths of time, before bones, before blood, before the rise of insect and reptile. There was only the sea, the sediment, and the strange still breath of the Ediacaran world. It was a beginning without spectacle, a revolution in whispers, and it changed everything that came after. 141 million years ago, life on Earth surged into a new era with breathtaking speed in a span of just 20 million years. A blink in geological time, the oceans teemed with an explosion of diverse, complex life forms. This was the Cambrian explosion, a period so dramatic and foundational that it redefined the very concept of evolution. Bodies with skeletons, eyes, mouths, and legs appeared. For the first time, predators stalked. Prey mobility became widespread. Ecosystems layered in complexity and competition. The Ediacaran silence was over the age of visible life had truly begun. It began with change. The Earth's climate stabilized after dramatic ice ages. Oxygen levels already increasing during the Ediacaran rose higher still, crossing critical thresholds that allowed for greater biological energy and metabolic activity. Shallow marine environments expanded as continents shifted, and seas flooded the lowlands. These coastal zones created ideal nurseries for innovation. The fossil record from the Cambrian period is extraordinarily rich. In places like the Burgess Shale of Canada, the Chenjiang Biota of China, and the Emu Bay Shale of Australia, scientists have uncovered entire snapshots of ancient marine communities preserved in astonishing detail. These sites reveal a cast of characters unlike any seen before or since. One of the stars of this revolution was trilobite, armored and segmented. Trilobites roam the seafloor like ancient tanks, using their many legs to scuttle over sediment in search of food. Some were small as grains of rice, others as large as a dinner plate. They had compound eyes made of calcite, giving them remarkable vision for the time. Trilobites were among the first animals to see the world with clarity. Another creature, Anomalocaris, patrolled the waters as one of the first apex predators. It swam with flaps along its body, using powerful frontal appendages to grasp prey, and a circular mouth lined with tooth-like plates to consume it at up to a meter in length. It dwarfed most other animals of the time and introduced the evolutionary pressure of predation, driving smaller creatures to adapt, hide, or escape. Opabinia, bizarre even by Cambrian standards, sported 5 stalked eyes and a long tubular proboscis. With a claw at the end, it maneuvered the seafloor with alien grace, plucking food from the sediment and water. Hallucinia, named for its dreamlike form, walked on spines and waved rows of soft tentacles above its body. It was like a walking contradiction, fragile yet armored, primitive yet strangely advanced. The Cambrian world was full of strange wonders. Waxia covered in scales and spines, Mela, with its fan-like tail and backward sweeping limbs, Pikaia, a slender swimmer with a notochord, possibly one of the earliest chordates. The group that would one day include fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. What fueled this explosion of form and function? There are many theories. Some scientists point to genetic innovation, the evolution of hawk genes which controlled the body plan of animals. With these master switches, organisms could more easily evolve new segments, limbs, and symmetry. Others argue that ecological interactions, especially predation, drove an evolutionary arms race that rewarded speed, defense, and strategy. Still others suggest chemical changes in the oceans provided a boost in minerals like calcium, enabling the creation of hard parts like shells and exoskeletons. But perhaps the most important factor was interaction in the Cambrian life no longer existed in isolation. Organisms now competed for food, space, and survival. Some formed symbiotic relationships, others preyed upon their neighbors. The web of life became more interconnected, more dynamic, and more volatile. This pressure led to adaptation, and adaptation led to diversity. During this time, the seafloor came alive. Burrowing animals churned the sediment, mixing oxygen into the ocean bed and transforming the chemistry of marine environments. Filter feeders, scavengers, grazers, and predators each carved out their ecological roles. Plankton bloomed near the surface, supporting entire food chains below. For the first time in Earth's history, complex food webs formed. There were primary producers, photosynthetic organisms, and algae. Primary consumers, grazing and filtering animals like early mollusks. Secondary consumers, small predators and scavengers, and tertiary predators like anomalies sitting at the top. This structure created stability and competition. The Cambrian explosion also marked a major leap in reproduction and development. Animals began producing specialized larvae that could drift in the water before settling down, increasing their chances of survival and dispersal. Sexual reproduction diversified, and with it, the genetic variation that evolution thrives upon. The result was a surge of innovation, unlike anything before. Within a few million years. All major animal body plants appear aeropods, mollusks, echinoderms, annelids, cnidarians, and even the earliest vertebrates. It was as if evolution had suddenly discovered a library of blueprints and began building in every direction. Not everything thrived. Many Cambrian organisms vanished without descendants, evolutionary dead ends that were outcompeted or outlasted. But others planted the roots of modern animal life. The ocean, once quiet and uniform, now pulsed with movement, interaction, and color, stellar in the Cambrian explosion. Life abandoned its caution. It burst forth with eyes, an armor with teeth and speed. The sea became a battleground of innovation, where the rules of modern ecosystems were first written in shells and sight and struggle. It was the first age of monsters, of invention, of life daring to take new forms before insects crawled the earth, before reptiles roamed the land. There were trilobites in the sand and predators in the current. This was the beginning of biology's boldest age. The Cambrian was not just an explosion. It was a declaration that life would never be the same again. Following the Cambrian explosion, the story of life continued to unfold with astonishing pace as the Cambrian period faded and the Orovision period emerged around 485 million years ago. Life on Earth began to evolve in new and unexpected directions. This was the age of expansion and colonization, a time when the oceans filled with even more complexity and power, and when ecosystems deepened in both scale and structure. The order of vision was a symphony of marine evolution, a time when life began to push the boundaries of the possible. The warm, shallow seas that covered much of the planet created vast habitats for marine organisms. Tectonic shifts shaped new coastlines, and volcanic activity under the oceans formed island chains and undersea ridges that became biodiversity hotspots. The oxygen-rich waters, along with an abundance of nutrients, fostered extraordinary evolutionary bursts, creatures that began their journey in the Cambrian now diversified into hundreds of new forms, while the Cambrian had introduced the blueprints of animal life. The order of vision built upon them with grandeur. Among the rulers of the order of vision seas were the cephalopod sentient relatives of today's squids and octopuses. Some grew to lengths of over 10 meters, using jet propulsion to glide through the water with eerie grace. They were efficient predators, their tentacles equipped with grasping suckers and beak-like mouths, capable of crunching hard shells. These early cephalopods became the first giants of the animal kingdom, a title that commanded respects in the developing food web. Brachiopods shelled filter feeders resembling clams but belonging to a different lineage spread across the seafloor in massive numbers. They anchored themselves to rocks and sediments with stalks swaying gently with the ocean currents to capture microscopic food. Their hard shells came in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and their success allowed them to dominate benthic ecosystems. Corals, too, began to flourish, forming the planet's first true reef systems. These weren't the vibrant coral reefs we see today, but primitive versions built by early coral species and sponges. Nevertheless, they created intricate underwater structures that housed entire communities of marine life. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lice, waved their feathery arms in the current from anchored stalks, filtering plankton from the water. Arthropods continued their evolutionary journey. Trilobites, though no longer the dominant innovators of the sea, remained a major presence. They had diversified into new ecological niches, burrowed into sediment. Others swam near the surface, while others developed elaborate spines and ornamentation for defense or display. Their adaptations reflected the increasingly competitive nature of marine life. New groups began to make their mark. Bryozoans formed delicate branching colonies that looked like underwater lace. These colonial animals filtered water for nutrients, and their dense structures provided shelter for smaller creatures. Echinoderms, such as early sea stars and sea cucumbers, added more variety to the marine floor, feeding on detritus and preying upon softer-bodied animals. Most remarkably, vertebrates took a significant evolutionary leap. During this time, jawless fish agnathons emerged as some of the earliest backboned animals, encased in armored plates and equipped with rudimentary fins. They were slow but persistent swimmers, likely feeding on organic particles or small prey, while primitive, these creatures laid the foundation for the entire vertebrate lineage. The complexity of Orovision ecosystems extended beyond individual species. Entire food webs grew in sophistication. Microscopic plankton supported larger filter feeders. These, in turn, became prey for carnivores and scavengers. Detritus from dead organisms fed bottom dwellers, the recycling of organic material, the specialization of feeding strategies, and the diversification of body forms transformed marine life into a layered network of interdependence. Stella. This was a time of orchestration, not explosion. Life moved beyond the initial burst of invention into the rhythm of refinement. Every creature had its place, its function, and its contribution to the unfolding ecosystem, from the smallest plankton to the largest cephalopod. Each played a role in the great marine chorus of the order. During this period, climate and geological shifts were ongoing. Continents drifted across the globe, and the supercontinent of Gondwana began a slow journey toward the South Pole glaciation. Events later in the Ordovician would lock vast quantities of water into ice, causing dramatic drops in sea level. This had profound effects on marine life, exposing shallow habitats, collapsing ecosystems, and triggering one of the first mass extinctions in Earth's history. Nevertheless, before this crisis, the Orevich seas had reached an evolutionary zenith. The diversity of life rivaled anything seen before. Ecosystems were stable, productive, and dynamic. Species interacted in complex webs of dependency and competition. For tens of millions of years, life in the Ordovician Ocean was a masterpiece of balance. It was also during this period that the foundations of future terrestrial life began to stir in isolated tidal flats and marshy coastlines. Some evidence suggests that photosynthetic organisms, algae, and possibly even the earliest land plants began to colonize the edge of the land. Their quiet presence foreshadowed a dramatic future. Migration. The conquest of the continents, stellar in the order of vision. The sea was not just a habitat, it was the heart of life. Every wave carried generations of innovation. Every current bore the story of adaptation. Life had grown bold and interconnected. The reef, the predator, the grazer, the filter. They all sang the same evolutionary song, a song that would echo into every future chapter of Earth's unfolding tale, before insects buzzed the forests, before reptiles basked in the sun. There was this vast underwater kingdom, a realm of shells and tentacles, of silent hunters and drifting colonies. This was life, perfecting its performance, rehearsing for the dramas that would one day unfold. On land, the air was thick with moisture. The land, still freshly claimed from the ancient oceans, was wrapped in silence, broken only by the slow rustle of primitive ferns swaying under warm winds. This was a time when the continents were still barren, compared to the vibrancy they would one day know, yet something profound stirred beneath the fallen plant matter and creeping mosses. Earth was about to welcome its first tiny wanderers. Life on land had already begun, its delicate push forward. Plants had led the way. By now, the earliest terrestrial flora simple, liverworts and mosses, were joined by more advanced vascular plants, reaching skyward with tube-like structures to transport water and nutrients. These green colonizers transformed the atmosphere steadily, increasing the oxygen levels and laying down the very foundation for animal life to leave the sea behind. And that transition, cautious, gradual, yet momentous, would be led by the ancestors of Isissex in the shallow streams and soggy soils of the early Devonian, around 400 to 390 million years ago. The first known insects emerged. They were wingless, small, and primitive, bearing little resemblance to the buzzing, flying creatures we know today. Their purpose was simple: survive, feed, and reproduce in a world filled with new challenges and opportunities. These early arthropods likely evolved from freshwater crustacean, shrimp-like beings that had developed strong, segmented limbs. Their hard exoskeletons offered protection against desiccation, a vital trait in a dry and dangerous world. Their jointed legs allowed for nimble crawling among plant stems and decaying wood. The key to their success, however, lay in their respiratory system. Tracheae, small internal tubes that carried oxygen directly to their tissues. This design allowed them to thrive even with minimal oxygen. Crucial advantage in the unpredictable early atmosphere, their fossils are rare, mostly preserved as faint impressions in ancient rock. But even these ghostly records tell stories, one such imprint from Rhynie CH in Scotland, of the most famous Dionian fossil beds, shows a tiny insect-like creature called Rhenella. Precursor. It may have been no larger than a grain of rice, yet it is among the oldest known terrestrial aeropods. It walked among fungi, slime molds, and other primitive soil. Dwellers playing its role in breaking down organic matter and enriching the soil for future forests. The world it inhabited was changing. Simple root systems of early plants held the soil together. Fungi and bacteria decomposed dead vegetation. And as plant life expanded across the land, it created a patchwork of shaded environments, humid microclimates, and nutrientric detritus, ideal conditions for crawling insects. These creatures were not alone in their conquest of the land. Millipedes and centipedes, already established from earlier periods, scuttled alongside them. Some of these myriads were detrites feeding on rotting plant matter, while others hunted small invertebrates. Spiders had not yet evolved, but the earliest predatory arthropods were beginning to emerge, creatures with strong mandibles and sharp reflexes in this silent, low-lying forest realm. An evolutionary race unfolded. The insects began to specialize. Some developed powerful mandibles for chewing through tough plant tissues. Others honed chemical sensors on their antennae to detect pheromones. Water sources or prey the need to reproduce efficiently drove new adaptation sieging strategies, hiding spots, and even protective behaviors. They were not yet flyers. Wings would not appear until tens of millions of years later, but their crawling presence left a marked tiny tunnels in fossilized wood, intricate patterns in petrified bark, and molted exoskeletons trapped in amber-like resin. These were signs of a quiet revolution beneath the roots of the plants. Something even more astonishing was happening. Fungal networks, known today as microa, were connecting plant life underground. These networks allowed trees and shrubs to share nutrients, defend against pathogens, and even warn each other of environmental stress. Some early insects may have played a role in maintaining this system, spreading spores, feeding on decaying fungal threads, or interacting with the rheospheres of the plants themselves. Meanwhile, on the edges of ponds and slow-moving streams, amphibians were beginning to appear. They would eventually rise to dominate the food chains of the land. But in these early days, the insects had less competition. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and adaptability allowed them to explore niches no other creature could claim under stones. Within hollow twigs, among the decomposing fern, they became the unseen engineers of this young terrestrial biosphere. The climate during this time was warm and relatively stable. There were no ice caps at the poles, and the equatorial regions were humid and lush. Rivers meandered through the forests of lycopites, club mosses, and early ferns. The oxygen content of the atmosphere was rising steadily, in part due to the photosynthetic activity of these plants, and as oxygen increased, so did the metabolic potential of the insects. Their bodies grew slightly larger. Their behaviors became more complex. Predators began to notice. Amphibians with strong jaws and grasping limbs hunted the slowest among them. Other aeropods turned against their kind. Still, the insects persisted, evolving harder shells, stronger legs, better camouflage. In the absence of flying vertebrates or fast, moving reptiles. They were unchallenged in the canopy. They became herbivores, dittovores, scavengers, and eventually pollinators, though flowers had not yet evolved early. Seed-bearing plants may have already been shaped by the movements of these tiny creatures. Coevolution had begun in whispers, as forests thickened the microclimates. Within them created new habitats, damp, shaded hollows, sunlit clearings, moss-covered logs. Insects diversified to meet these conditions. Some became burrowers, digging into soft soils to escape predators or lay eggs. Others developed harder exoskeletons to withstand the abrasive textures of plant surfaces. Still others remained translucent and soft-bodied, hiding from the sun and living short, hidden lives. It was during this time that social behaviors may have first appeared, perhaps among some early lineages of termites or beetle-like creatures. Rudimentary communication evolved simple, pheromone trails, protective, brooding of eggs, warning vibrations. These behaviors would later blossom into the complex societies of ants, bees, and wasps. But even now, the roots of such intelligence were taking hold by 390 million years ago. The land was alive in a new way. It pulsed not only with green, but with movement. An unseen multitude of legs crawled over every surface, a symphony of chewing, burrowing, and feeding. Played below the audible range, these were not creatures of strength or size, but of strategy, flexibility, and persistence. They would outlast their early amphibian neighbors. They would witness the rise and fall of forests, climates, and even continents. They would shrink, grow, evolve wings, and eventually become the masters of the skies. But in this moment, just before that leap, they remained humble land crawlers, the first insects, the silent stewards of an earth still learning to breathe the Carboniferous. Period spanning from about 360 to 300 million years ago marked a golden age of life on Earth. The planet was a vast, humid world, thick with lush forests and swamplands that stretched across the continents. This was an environment so different from the one we know today, where towering plants dominated the land and the air was rich with oxygen. This period set the stage for some of the largest aeropods ever to exist, creatures that seem almost like fantasy beings. But once crawled across the earth in the early stages of life before the rise of reptiles and dinosaurs, the overwhelming characteristic of the Carboniferous was its abundant plant life. The dense green forest grew without the modern limitations we see today. Trees reached immense heights, towering as much as 30 meters above the ground, far higher than anything that could survive in today's atmospheric conditions. Fern-like plants, giant horsetails and club mosses dominated the landscape, spreading out across vast wetlands and river systems. These plants were not only impressive in size, but also in their ability to produce oxygen. The Carboniferous atmosphere contained far more oxygen than today's, reaching levels up to 35%, compared to the present-day 21%. This surge in oxygen was the result of the vast amounts of photosynthesis taking place across the land, as the dense plant life produced oxygen and removed carbon dioxide from the air for life forms of the time. This high oxygen content was a double-edged sword. It allowed many organisms to grow to enormous sizes, but it also created a fragile balance in the ecosystem, one that could be easily tipped by environmental shifts. It was this oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed arthropods to reach their greatest size. The lack of vertebrate predators meant that in insects and other arthropods ruled the land, air, and water. Some of the largest insects to ever exist were present during this time, their massive forms towering over the smaller creatures of earlier periods, dragonflies with wingspans of over 70 centimeters, nearly the length of a human arm, flitted through the air. Millipedes, such as the giant Aeropura, grew to lengths of over 2 meters. Their segmented bodies crawling along the moist forest floor in search of decaying plant matter. To feed on these creatures were not only formidable due to their size, but also because of their specialized adaptations. They were perfectly suited to this dense, oxygen-rich world. The giant dragonflies were some of the most fascinating and terrifying of these prehistoric insects. They were not the delicate, swift-flying creatures we see today, but instead, their large, powerful wings were used to traverse the thick, humid air, preying on smaller insects and even amphibians. Their large eyes allowed them to see their surroundings with remarkable clarity, helping them to detect both prey and predators. The presence of such formidable predators meant that even the largest insects had to evolve rapid reflexes and defensive strategies, such as camouflage, or the ability to fly quickly and unpredictably to escape danger. Millipedes like Aeropura were among the Earth's largest terrestrial creatures. Their massive size was an evolutionary response to the high oxygen content of the atmosphere, which allowed their large bodies to sustain themselves. Their hard, armored exoskeletons offered protection from predators, while their many legs helped them move through the dense underbrush, feeding on decomposing plant material. Their size, however, also made them more vulnerable to environmental changes, especially as the atmosphere began to change toward the end of the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous period also saw the first significant appearance of winged insects, although insects had been crawling on land for millions of years. By this point, the development of flight marked a major evolutionary leap. The first winged insects were not yet the diverse species we would recognize today, but were an important precursor to the diversity that would come later. These flying insects had light, delicate wings that allowed them to escape predators and explore new niches within the environment. They were the forerunners of the many flying insect species that would come to dominate the skies. In later periods in the water, large aquatic arthropods, such as the euryperids or sea scorpions, still dominated the ecosystems. These creatures were terrifying in appearance, with long, spiny appendages and pincers capable of capturing smaller animals. Their presence in the Carboniferous oceans was a reminder of the link between the land and marine ecosystems, as life on Earth was slowly becoming more interconnected across different environments, despite the abundance and diversity of life during the Carboniferous. This era was not without its challenges. The high oxygen content of the atmosphere created an unstable balance within ecosystems where the growth of plants and the flourishing of arthropods often outpaced the development of other life forms. Although amphibians had begun to take their first steps onto land, they were still limited in their ability to survive in the harsh, oxygen-rich atmosphere. This was a world dominated by invertebrates, with the first true reptiles yet to emerge. The Carboniferous period also saw the formation of the supercontinent Pangaea. The shifting of Earth's tectonic plates caused the land masses to collide, forming vast land masses surrounded by an ever-changing array of shallow seas. These environmental changes contributed to fluctuations in sea levels, climate, and the types of vegetation that could thrive in different regions, while the forests and swamps continued to flourish in some areas. Others saw the spread of more arid, desert-like conditions. As the climate slowly began to shift by the end of the Carboniferous, however, the world would begin to change, the climate would cool, and the oxygen levels in the atmosphere would begin to drop. The lush, oxygen-rich forests that had supported the giant insects and arthropods would start to disappear, paving the way for new forms of life to emerge. The rise of the first true reptiles, along with the ongoing evolution of amphibians, would slowly push the aeropods into a secondary role in the ecosystem. This would mark the beginning of the end for the giant insects that had once ruled the land. Yet even as the Carboniferous period came to a close, the legacy of the giant insects would remain. Their evolutionary success had set the stage for the more complex ecosystems that would follow, and their adaptations would influence the development of life on Earth for millions of years to come. The high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous created a world where life could grow to unimaginable sizes, and the aeropods of the time, some of the most remarkable creatures to ever live, left a lasting imprint on the history of life on Earth. The Permian period, which spanned from approximately 299 to 252 million years ago, represents the final era of the Paleozoic era, and it was a time of dramatic transformation in the history of life on Earth. It was a time when the planet began its slow but inevitable transition from the lush, oxygen-rich world of the Carboniferous to a harsher, drier landscape that would soon give rise to the reptiles that would dominate the Earth for the next 200 million years. This was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of life, one that would set the stage for the eventual rise of dinosaurs and the ecosystems they would rule the formation of Pangea and the changing climate. The Permian period was marked by significant geological activity, primarily the formation of the supercontinent, Pangea. Pangea was a massive landmass that included nearly all of Earth's continents, merging together over millions of years through the movement of tectonic plates. The consolidation of these landmasses had far-reaching consequences for the planet's climate and ecosystems. The formation of Pangea led to a dramatic shift in the Earth's environment, as vast areas of the planet that had once been isolated by oceans were now connected, creating new pathways for migration and interaction among species. With the formation of Pangea, the planet's climate became much more variable. The interior of the supercontinent, far from the moderating influence of the oceans, became arid and desert-like. Much of the landscape was dry, with vast stretches of land that received little rainfall on the edges of Pangea. However, the climate was more temperate, and regions near the coastline still enjoyed more favorable conditions with moist environments that allowed for the persistence of life. But as the center of the continent dried out, the ecosystems began to change dramatically as the Permian progressed. The climate continued to warm, and the planet became increasingly inhospitable to the plants and animals that had flourished during the previous period. The once dominant forests of the Carboniferous period began to shrink, and the lush wetlands that had been home to many life forms turned into arid landscapes, where only the most adaptable organisms could survive. Plants that could tolerate the dry conditions, such as gymnosperms, began to take over, while the once verdant swamps and forests began to dwindle. This shift in the environment would lead to the extinction of many species, particularly those that had relied on a moist, humid climate. The rise of reptiles, the first true land vertebrates, amid these changes. The most significant event of the Permian period was the rise of the first true reptiles, while amphibians had dominated the Earth for millions of years. It was the reptiles that began to emerge during the Permian that would eventually dominate the planet. Reptiles were better equipped to survive in the increasingly dry conditions of the Permian world. Their waterproof, scaly skin was a major advantage, allowing them to retain water and thrive in environments that would have been inhospitable to amphibians. Unlike amphibians, which needed to live in or near water to reproduce, reptiles were able to lay their eggs on land, giving them a significant advantage in the rapidly changing world. Reptiles had been around for some time before the Permian period, but it was during this era that they truly began to diversify and adapt to the shifting environment. Early reptiles like the Paleozoics, which were more primitive than the reptiles we recognize today, were among the first to make the transition from amphibious lifestyles to life entirely on land. These reptiles had a variety of body shapes and sizes, with some being large and predatory, while others were herbivorous and smaller. Their adaptations to life on land, including the development of hard waterproof eggs, marked a turning point in the history of vertebrates. The Paleozoics, for example, included some of the largest and most successful reptiles of the time, such as the Dimetrodon. This reptile, with its distinctive sei-like structure on its back, was a formidable predator. It had a large head and sharp teeth that allowed it to hunt the smaller, more primitive life forms that populated the Permian world. The Dimetrodon sail may have been used for thermoregulation, helping it absorb heat from the sun during the cold mornings and providing it with the energy needed to hunt and survive in the increasingly harsh environment. Other reptiles, like the more basal synapsids, were also part of the evolving landscape of the Permian period. These reptiles were the ancestors of the mammals, and while they were not yet mammals themselves, they were beginning to evolve certain characteristics that would be important for the later evolution of mammals. These synapsids were characterized by a single temporal fenestra in the skull, a feature that allowed for greater jaw muscle attachment, which contributed to stronger bites and more efficient feeding. Decline of amphibians and the rise of new ecosystems. The rise of reptiles came at the expense of amphibians, which had once dominated the land. Amphibians had been successful in the moist, swampy environments of the Carboniferous period. But as the Permian climate became drier, amphibians began to struggle their skin, which was not as resistant to water loss as that of reptiles, made it difficult for them to survive in the increasingly arid conditions, while some amphibians were able to adapt to the changing environment. Many species went extinct as the planet's ecosystem shifted. This extinction of amphibians cleared the way for reptiles to take their place in the food chains of the Permian world. The decline of amphibians also had a profound impact on the plants of the time. With the reduction in the number of herbivorous amphibians, the plants that once had been heavily grazed began to flourish. The Permian period saw the rise of more drought-tolerant plants, including gymnosperms, like conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. These plants were able to withstand the increasingly dry conditions, and their seeds, which were adapted for life in dry environments, allowed them to reproduce in a world where water was no longer as abundant. These plants became the dominant flora of the Permian, and their presence helped shape the food chains that would develop during this period. The Great Permian Extinction, a catastrophic event toward the end of the Permian. The planet faced a catastrophic event that would forever alter the course of life on Earth. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, also known as the Great Dying, was the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. It is estimated that more than 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species went extinct. During this event, the causes of the Permian extinction are still a topic of scientific debate, but it is believed that a combination of factors, including volcanic activity, climate change, and a reduction in oxygen levels, contributed to the collapse of ecosystems around the world. One of the primary causes of the Permian extinction was the massive volcanic eruptions that occurred during this period. The eruptions, which were part of the Siberian traps in present-day Russia, released vast amounts of carbon dioxide, oxide, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This caused a dramatic increase in global temperatures, creating a runaway greenhouse effect. The Earth's climate became much warmer, and this warming triggered a cascade of environmental changes, including ocean acidification, a reduction in oxygen levels in both the oceans and the atmosphere, and the collapse of food chains. The warming of the planet also led to the loss of habitat for many species. The once thriving ecosystems of the Permian, including the forests and wetlands, began to dry up. As the climate became hotter and drier, plant life, which had been the foundation of these ecosystems, began to wither and die, leading to a collapse in herbivore populations. This in turn affected predator species, including the early reptiles, which found themselves without sufficient food. The result was widespread extinction, with only the most adaptable species surviving the cataclysmic event. Recovery and the rise of the dinosaurs, the aftermath of the Permian extinction event, left the planet in a state of recovery. Ecosystems were devastated, and many species had been wiped out, leaving the Earth in a much different state than before. The survivors of the extinction event, however, found new opportunities in the empty niches left behind. The reptiles that had evolved during the Permian, which had already adapted to the changing climate and environment, were now poised to take advantage of the new conditions. This marked the beginning of the Mesozoic era, a time when dinosaurs would rise to dominance and rule the Earth for millions of years. The extinction event and the environmental changes it caused were pivotal moments in the history of life on Earth. The reptiles that survived the Permian extinction would go on to become the ancestors of the dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. Their evolution in the wake of the Permian catastrophe set the stage for the dramatic developments that would follow in the Triassic and beyond. The Triassic period, which lasted from about 252 to 201 million years ago, marked the beginning of the Mesozoic era, often referred to as the Age of Dinosaurs, following the devastation of the Permian mass extinction. The Earth was in a state of recovery. Ecosystems had collapsed, and much of the life that had previously existed was gone. However, in this new, rapidly changing world, life began to rebuild itself, and the stage was set for the rise of new, more dominant species. The Triassic was a time of experimentation in the evolutionary process, with many different types of life forms emerging and evolving a new Earth. Climate and geography in the Triassic. The Earth of the Triassic was a vastly different place from the world that had existed before the Permian extinction. The once vast supersea continent of Pangaea was slowly beginning to break apart, a process that would continue throughout the Mesozoic era. As Pangaea began to fracture, the planet's climate began to shift, leading to new geographical features and ecosystems in the early Triassic. Much of the land was still arid and desert-like, with vast stretches of dry land that saw little rainfall. However, as the period progressed, climates began to stabilize and the Earth started to recover from the climatic turmoil caused by the Permian extinction. During the Triassic, the planet's oceans began to recover from the effects of the extinction event. Marine life was once again thriving with new species of fish, marine reptiles, and invertebrates, evolving to fill the niches left behind by the mass extinction. The reestablishment of marine ecosystems played a crucial role in the rebuilding of life on Earth, as these creatures helped to bring balance to the planet's ecosystems, which had been severely disrupted by the earlier events in terms of climate. The early Triassic was still characterized by high temperatures, especially in the interior of the supercontinent. Pangaea, however, as the climate gradually began to stabilize, different regions of the planet experienced different conditions. Coastal areas were generally more temperate, while the interior regions remained hot and dry. This division in climate created a variety of different ecosystems, from deserts to wetlands, which provided a range of environments for new life forms to evolve. The rise of the first dinosaurs. One of the most significant developments of the Triassic period was the emergence of the first dinosaurs. Although the precursors to dinosaurs had been around for some time, it was during the Triassic that these animals began to diversify and evolve into the dominant forms of life on Earth. The first dinosaurs were small, bipedal creatures, and they were relatively unremarkable compared to the giant, fearsome reptiles that would later dominate the planet. However, the evolutionary potential of the dinosaurs was vast, and over the course of the Triassic, they would evolve into a wide variety of forms, from the small, agile predators to the massive, long-necked herbivores that would later become iconic. The earliest dinosaurs, such as Herrerasaurus and Eoraptor, were small, fast-moving predators that hunted in the relatively sparse ecosystems of the Triassic. These early dinosaurs were still in the process of adapting to the changing world, and they coexisted with other groups of reptiles, including the Aerosaurs, which were the ancestors of crocodiles and birds. The early Triassic was a time of experimentation in the evolution of dinosaurs, with new species constantly emerging and adapting to the shifting environment. Dinosaurs were not the only group of animals that evolved during the Triassic period. Other reptiles, including the early crocodile-like animals and the first flying reptiles known as pterosaurs, also began to diversify. During this time, pterosaurs, though not dinosaurs, were closely related to them and represented an early branch of the Aerosaur family tree. They were among the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight, and their wingspans ranged from small bat-like creatures to larger species with wingspans that could exceed 10 meters reptilian dominance. Other life forms of the Triassic. While dinosaurs were emerging as the dominant terrestrial vertebrates, other groups of reptiles were also evolving and adapting to the changing world. Aerosaurs. The group of reptiles that would give rise to both dinosaurs and crocodiles were becoming increasingly diverse. Some aerosaurs evolved into large, predatory forms, while others took on more specialized roles. The first true crocodiles appeared during the Triassic, with species like the crocodile forms occupying freshwater environments and filling the role of apex predators in many ecosystems. Marine life was also undergoing a significant transformation during the Triassic period. Although the oceans had been devastated by the Permian extinction, they began to recover during the Triassic, and new species of marine reptiles emerged to fill the ecological niches. Ichthyosaurs, reptiles that resembled dolphins, became dominant marine predators, while the long-necked plesiosaurs filled the role of opportunistic feeders in the ocean. These marine reptiles were a crucial part of the recovery of marine ecosystems, and their presence played a key role in maintaining the balance of life in the oceans. In addition to the reptiles, the Triassic period saw the emergence of the first true mammals. Though mammals were still small nocturnal creatures during the Triassic, they represented an important step in the evolutionary history of life on Earth. These early mammals were likely small insect-eating creatures that skewered in the underbrush, living in the shadow of the larger reptiles that dominated the Earth. Mammals were still far from the diverse, dominant group that they would later become. But the Triassic marked the beginning of their evolutionary journey. The end of the Triassic, a second mass extinction. The end of the Triassic period was marked by yet another mass extinction event, the cause of which is still debated by scientists. This extinction event wiped out a significant portion of life on Earth, including many species of marine reptiles, large amphibians, and some of the early dinosaurs. The exact cause of the Triassic extinction remains unclear, but it is thought to have been triggered by a combination of volcanic activity, climate change, and possibly the impact of a comet or asteroid. The volcanic activity during the late Triassic was intense, with massive eruptions releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. This warming, combined with the decrease in oxygen levels, created an inhospitable environment for many species. The extinction event at the end of the Triassic allowed the surviving dinosaurs to expand and diversify, and it is believed that the dinosaurs that survived the Triassic extinction event were the ancestors of the massive, iconic species that would dominate the Earth during the Jurassic period legacy of the Triassic, the rise of the Jurassic world. The Triassic period was a time of transition and transformation. Life on Earth had endured the greatest mass extinction event in history and emerged from the ashes, with new groups of animals evolving to fill the ecological niches left behind. The rise of dinosaurs, along with the diversification of other reptilian groups, marked the beginning of the Mesozoic era and set the stage for the dominance of these creatures. For the next 150 million years, the end of the Triassic period saw the emergence of the first true dinosaurs that would go on to rule the planet. But it also marked the end of an era in which reptiles ruled, setting the stage for a new age of giants, where the mighty dinosaurs would become the stars of the Earth's ecosystems. The Jurassic period, which lasted from about 2015 million years ago, was a time of tremendous growth and expansion for life on Earth. It followed the Triassic period and marked a significant shift in the evolution of life. During the Jurassic, dinosaurs grew larger, more diverse, and more dominant, while other forms of life also evolved to fill the niches in the recovering ecosystems. The planet's geography continued to change, and the climate became more favorable to life, creating a lush, vibrant world that would serve as the stage for the reign of the dinosaurs, geography, and climate. The shaping of the Jurassic world. The Jurassic period was characterized by significant geological and climatic changes that shaped the ecosystems in which life flourished. Pangaea, the supercontinent that had formed in the late Paleozoic, was continuing to break apart by the time of the Jurassic. The landmasses had begun to separate into smaller continents, creating new oceans and seas, and shifting the climate across the globe. The early Jurassic was marked by a warm, humid climate, which provided ideal conditions for plant life. To thrive, dense forests of conifers, cycads, and ferns spread across much of the Earth's land masses, creating a rich, green landscape. The warm climate allowed for abundant plant life, which in turn supported a wide variety of herbivorous dinosaurs. The combination of warm temperatures and high levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide helped to create a lush, vibrant environment that was perfect for the growing populations of dinosaurs. As Pangaea continued to break apart, the new seas and oceans began to take shape. Shallow marine environments, including vast inland seas, provided ideal habitats for marine reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. The increased separation of land masses also helped to create distinct ecosystems, each with its own unique plant and animal life. The shifting geography, along with the favorable climate, created a world that was both dynamic and diverse. The rise of the dinosaurs, giants of the Jurassic. The Jurassic period is perhaps most famous for the rise of the giant dinosaurs that would dominate the planet for millions of years. By the middle of the Jurassic, dinosaurs were the dominant land vertebrates, and they would continue to evolve into a wide range of sizes and forms. Some of the most iconic dinosaurs of all time, including the long-necked sauropods and the fierce theropods, began to evolve during this period. The sauropods, such as Brachiosaurus and Apatosaurus, were among the largest creatures to ever walk the Earth. These long-necked, herbivorous dinosaurs grew to enormous sizes, with some species reaching lengths of over 100 feet. Their long necks allowed them to feed on high branches of trees, giving them access to a food source that other herbivores couldn't reach. The sauropods' massive size was an evolutionary advantage, as it made them less vulnerable to predators. Their size also allowed them to travel great distances in search of food and water, making them some of the most successful dinosaurs of the Jurassic theropods. The carnivorous dinosaurs also evolved into many different forms during the Jurassic. Species like Allosaurus and Dilophosaurus were among the apex predators of the time, hunting in packs and preying on smaller herbivores and even other dinosaurs. These large predators were characterized by their sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and agile bodies, making them highly effective hunters. Some theropods, like the feathered velociraptor, which evolved later, would go on to become some of the most famous dinosaurs of all time. But it was during the Jurassic that the first true theropods began to dominate. The Jurassic was also a time of significant innovation in dinosaur evolution. The first flying dinosaurs, or pterosaurs, evolved during this period, with species like Pteranodon and Asderid. Taking to the skies, these flying reptiles were not true dinosaurs, but they were closely related and represented an early branch of the Aerosaur family tree. Pterosaurs had wingspans ranging from small, bird-like creatures to larger species with wingspans exceeding 30 feet. Their ability to fly allowed them to hunt in new ways, and they played an important role in the ecosystem as both predators and scavengers marine life. The oceans of the Jurassic. While dinosaurs were dominating the land, the oceans were also teeming with life marine. Reptiles, including ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and plesiosaurs, were among the most successful animals of the Jurassic period. Ichthyosaurs, which resembled modern dolphins, were apex predators in the oceans, feeding on fish and squid. They were highly specialized for life in the water, with streamlined bodies and long, sharp teeth. Their evolution was an example of how life on Earth was diversifying and adapting to the changing environments. Plesiosaurs, with their long necks and small heads, were another group of marine reptiles that flourished during the Jurassic. These creatures were well adapted for life in the oceans, using their four flippers to propel themselves through the water. Some plesiosaurs were predators, while others were herbivores, feeding on seaweed and other plant life in the shallow coastal waters. Their long necks allowed them to reach food sources that other marine reptiles couldn't access. Pliosaurs, another group of marine reptiles, were more closely related to the larger predatories, reptiles of the land. These apex predators, such as Leopuridon, had powerful jaws and sharp teeth, allowing them to hunt large fish and other marine reptiles. Their size and strength made them the dominant predators of the seas. During the Jurassic, the dawn of birds. A new chapter in evolution, one of the most significant evolutionary events of the Jurassic period, was the emergence of the first true birds. Birds are descended from small theropod dinosaurs. And during the Jurassic, the first true birds began to evolve from their dinosaur ancestors. Archaeopteryx, one of the earliest known birds, appeared during the late Jurassic. It had feathers and wings, like a modern bird, but it still retained many characteristics of its dinosaur ancestors, including teeth, a long tail, and clawed hands. Archaeopteryx and other early birds were small arboreal creatures that likely used their wings for gliding and possibly for short flights. Their ability to fly was an evolutionary advantage, allowing them to escape predators and access food sources that were otherwise out of reach. The evolution of flight in birds marked a major milestone in the history of life on Earth and paved the way for the incredible diversity of birds that would later dominate the skies. The end of the Jurassic, preparing for the Cretaceous. The Jurassic period ended about 145 million years ago, and by the time it closed, the world had undergone significant changes. Dinosaurs had become firmly established as the dominant land vertebrates, and they would continue to evolve into even larger and more diverse forms. In the coming Cretaceous period, the oceans were teeming with marine reptiles, and the first birds were beginning to take flight. As the Jurassic came to a close, the planet was on the brink of yet another major shift in its biological history. The end of the Jurassic would lead into the Cretaceous, a period that would see the rise of even larger dinosaurs, the continued evolution of marine reptiles, and the diversification of flowering plants. It would also be a time of significant geological change, with the Earth's continents continuing to drift apart, and the stage would be set for some of the most iconic and massive creatures to ever walk the Earth. The end of the Jurassic period, around 145 million years ago, marked a significant transition in Earth's history. While the Jurassic had been a time of remarkable growth and diversification for life, the shift to the next geological period, the Cretaceous, would bring both new opportunities and challenges. During the Jurassic, life had evolved in incredible ways, with massive sauropods roaming the land, fearsome theropods dominating as apex predators, and the first birds taking to the skies. The oceans were equally teeming with marine reptiles, including ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and the largest of all marine predators, Paleozoic. The planet had seen dramatic shifts in geography and climate setting, the stage for the next phase of Earth's evolutionary story. But as the Jurassic period came to an end, the world was on the cusp of profound changes that would reshape life on Earth. New species were emerging, but they faced an increasingly competitive world. The land masses were shifting, and the atmosphere was evolving. These changes would pave the way for the dominant life forms of the next period, but they would also set in motion the processes that would lead to the end of an era, the slow transition climate and environmental shifts. The transition from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous was not marked by a single catastrophic event, but rather by a slow and gradual shift in the planet's climate and environment. The global climate began to warm, creating more arid conditions in certain regions. Large areas of lush, humid forests that had flourished during the Jurassic began to dry up, replaced by more open grass-land-like environments. This environmental shift had significant impacts on the flora and fauna of the time. As the climate warmed and the Earth's atmospheric conditions changed, plant life also evolved. The Jurassic had been dominated by conifers, cycads, and ferns. But with the coming of the Cretaceous, flowering plangioperms began to make their appearance. These plants were highly adaptable, and their spread would eventually revolutionize ecosystems, providing new food sources for herbivores and offering fresh opportunities for the evolution of new species. This shift in climate also affected the dinosaurs, herbivorous. Dinosaurs, like the sauropods, continued to thrive, but the changing landscape meant they had to adapt to new types of vegetation. Predators, too, faced new challenges as their prey evolved and changed. In the oceans, marine reptiles adapted to the changing conditions, with some evolving new forms to cope with shifting water temperatures and sea levels, a changing world. The opening of new ecosystems as the continents drifted further apart, they began to form new ecosystems, creating new opportunities for life to flourish. The breakup of Pangea had already begun during the Jurassic, and by the end of the period, the Earth's land masses were becoming increasingly distinct with new oceans, and seas came new opportunities for marine life. And as the land masses continued to shift, different regions developed their own unique ecosystems. The Jurassic had been a time of relative uniformity in the distribution of species, with dinosaurs and other creatures spread across the globe. But as the continents broke apart, isolated regions began to develop distinct ecosystems and species. In these regions began to evolve in ways that reflected the new conditions. Some species thrived in isolation, adapting to the changing environment, while others struggled to survive in the face of new competition and changing conditions. This fragmentation of ecosystems was especially significant in the oceans, where the separation of continents created new marine environments. New shallow seas formed as the continents moved, providing fertile grounds for marine life. These environments allowed marine reptiles to flourish, while also providing opportunities for other forms of life, such as fish, to evolve in new ways. Dinosaurs at the crossroads, new dominance on the horizon. By the end of the Jurassic period, dinosaurs were firmly established as the dominant life forms on land. But the shift into the Cretaceous would see an even greater rise in the diversity and dominance of these remarkable creatures. Many of the iconic dinosaurs of the Jurassic period, like the massive sauropods and the fearsome theropods, would continue to evolve and thrive. However, the Jurassic also saw the rise of new forms, some of which would go on to become the titans of the Cretaceous. During the final stages of the Jurassic theropods, like Allosaurus and Dilophosaurus, dominated as apex predators. These large carnivorous dinosaurs were well adapted to hunting in packs and competing for food. However, the coming Cretaceous would see the rise of new and even larger theropods, including the mighty T-Rex, which would later become the most famous predator in dinosaur history. The herbivorous dinosaurs of the Jurassic, including the sauropods, would continue to dominate as well, but the coming period would bring with it new herbivores such as the armored ankylosaurs and the horned ceratopsians. The development of new plant species during the Cretaceous would give rise to new herbivorous species, further increasing the complexity and diversity of the ecosystems that existed during this time. The first flowering plants, a new era for life on Earth. One of the most significant changes during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous periods was the evolution and spread of flowering plants, or angioperms. These plants were much more efficient at reproduction than their predecessors, producing seeds encased in protective flowers. The rise of angioperms had a profound impact on the herbivorous dinosaurs, providing new sources of food and allowing for the diversification of species that relied on plants for sustenance. The spread of flowering plants also had a significant impact on the insect world. Insects, which had been evolving for millions of years, began to adapt to the new plants. As the flowering plants spread, so did the insects that pollinated them. This mutualistic relationship between plants and insects would go on to shape the ecosystems of the coming periods, setting the stage for the explosive diversification of life that would characterize the Cretaceous. The closing of the Jurassic, a world in flux. The end of the Jurassic was a time of transition, a time when the Earth was on the brink of significant changes. The rise of new species, the shifting climates, and the breaking apart of the continents set the stage for the next chapter in Earth's history. The Cretaceous period, but before the Jurassic would fully close, there were still significant events and transformations that would shape the course of life on Earth. In the oceans, marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and plesiosaurs had reached their peak during the Jurassic, but with the coming of the Cretaceous, the marine reptile world would undergo significant changes. The extinction of certain marine reptiles and the rise of new species would mark the end of the Jurassic and the beginning of a new chapter in the evolutionary story of Earth on land. The dinosaurs would continue to reign supreme, but the world was changing and new challenges would arise: the changing climate, the spread of new plants, and the isolation of ecosystems would all play a role in shaping the evolution of the creatures that lived during the Cretaceous. For many species, the end of the Jurassic would bring new opportunities, but for others, it would mark the beginning of a slow decline as the Earth entered a new phase in its history.